It was supposed to be a regular night, but for Jerome, a quiet janitor, everything changed in an instant. What happened next will shock you and reveal a truth no one saw coming. Watch till the end to see this unbelievable story unfold. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories and share your thoughts in the comments below. Jerome Brown had always kept to himself. For years, he'd worked as a janitor at the city courthouse, navigating the same silent, polished hallways each day. Most people who passed him saw only a man with a mop, a uniform, and downcast eyes, and rarely looked closer. If they had, they might have seen his eyes filled with weariness, the deep lines etched by years of hard work and endurance. Jerome knew his place, or at least that's what he'd been told. In the courthouse, he was invisible. Lawyers, clerks, and visitors rushed past him, heads high, their minds occupied with cases, rulings, and important decisions. Judges entered and exited their chambers, heels clicking sharply against the polished floors, voices low and commanding. Jerome had learned to expect the sidelong glances, the dismissive expressions, and the quiet judgment that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. Yet, among them all, no one showed him more open disdain than Judge Mary Harper. A prominent figure, known for her strict judgments and no-nonsense demeanor, Judge Harper held herself with an air of superiority, one that radiated from her every move. Her reputation in the courthouse was both respected and feared. But to Jerome, her treatment of him seemed to cross from indifferent to personal. Every evening, like clockwork, he would enter her chambers to clean after she left for the day. Papers would be scattered across the floor, coffee stains smeared over the polished wood of her desk, and scraps of wrappers and crumpled tissues strewn over the chairs. It was as if she deliberately created messes for him to clean. And every evening, as soon as she heard his cart squeak down the hallway, she'd toss some papers to the floor or spill coffee, all while watching him with that smirk. "Make sure it's spotless, Brown," she'd say, her tone dripping with condescension. "You know how much I value cleanliness." He'd nod, suppressing his urge to respond, and clean up the mess she created just for him. Day after day, Jerome endured her disdain in silence. He had no choice. He needed this job. Bills and rent loomed, and in this town his options were few. The sting of her words, the humiliation, it all became just another part of the routine, another burden to bear in silence. One cold evening, after finishing her office for what felt like the 1,000th time, Jerome gathered his things and headed home. The streets were dark and quiet, and a chill hung in the air. He walked along the edge of the road, his mind replaying the events of the day. Judge Harper's taunting smirk, the whispered judgments of the courthouse staff, and the quiet weariness that seemed to settle deeper into his bones each day. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a flicker of orange against the night. As he got closer, the flicker grew, flames beginning to lick the sides of a car parked on the side of the street. His steps slowed, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was seeing until he heard a faint scream, muffled and panicked, coming from inside the car. Without a second thought, Jerome broke into a run. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the car, its hood and sides now engulfed in flames. He peered through the window, barely able to make out the figure inside, frantically trying to escape. His blood ran cold as he recognized the face of Judge Harper. She was trapped, clawing at the door in a desperate attempt to escape. The seatbelt held her firm, and the door handle seemed jammed. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, and her mouth moved in silent screams, overwhelmed by the roar of the flames. Jerome didn't hesitate. He grabbed a small metal tool from his pocket, a habit he had picked up from years of repairing things around the courthouse, and slammed it against the window with all his strength. The glass shattered and smoke billowed out, thick and suffocating. Reaching inside, he unlocked the door and pulled it open, coughing as smoke stung his lungs. With one swift motion, he unlatched her seatbelt and grabbed her arm, pulling her out just as flames licked closer to the front seats. As they stumbled away from the car, an explosion rocked the air behind them, the car engulfed in a burst of fire and heat. Jerome instinctively shielded her, his body pressed against hers as debris scattered around them. His chest heaved, his muscles ached, but relief flooded through him as they reached the sidewalk away from the flames. For a moment, they stood in silence, both catching their breath. Judge Harper, her face smeared with soot and her robe singed at the edges, looked at him with a mix of shock and confusion. Jerome met her gaze, waiting, hoping for some small sign of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, but as the shock in her eyes faded, it was replaced by something else. Her expression hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and that familiar look of disdain crept back onto her face. She straightened, brushing off her clothes as if to erase any trace of his touch. "Stay away from me," she spat, her voice trembling yet filled with venom. Jerome blinked, taken aback. "What?" Just then, the blaring sound of sirens cut through the night, and flashing lights illuminated the street as police cars sped towards them. Jerome turned, his hands raised, still trying to comprehend her reaction. He had saved her, pulled her from certain death, yet her expression showed nothing but contempt. When the police arrived, Judge Harper was quick to speak, her voice filled with hysteria and accusation. "He attacked me!" she cried, pointing a shaking finger at Jerome. He set my car on fire. He tried to kill me." Jerome's heart sank as he stood frozen, disbelief washing over him. "No, that's not what happened," he shouted, his voice raw with shock. "I saved you. The car was on fire. I pulled you out." But her words had already taken root. The officers glanced between them, skepticism and disdain clear on their faces. Her status, her authority as a judge, seemed to drown out any truth Jerome might have tried to convey. "Sir, step back and put your hands behind your head," one of the officers commanded, voice cold and unyielding. Jerome tried to protest, to explain, but his words fell on deaf ears. Before he could make sense of what was happening, two officers descended on him, grabbing his arms and forcing him to the ground. His face pressed against the rough asphalt as cold handcuffs bit into his wrists. "Please, listen," he pleaded, his voice muffled by the ground. "I didn't do anything. I saved her." Judge Harper watched from a distance, her face blank, her cold gaze fixed on him as the officers dragged him toward the police car. The last thing he saw before they shoved him into the back seat was her indifferent stare, her expression void of any gratitude, and the flicker of a smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited as they closed the car door, his voice indifferent and detached, as if Jerome was nothing more than another criminal, another case. As the car pulled away, the weight of what had just happened settled over Jerome. In a moment, everything had turned against him. 1 minute, he was a man doing the right thing, saving a life, and the next, he was being driven away in handcuffs, accused of a crime he hadn't committed. Through the tinted windows, Jerome saw Judge Harper speaking with the officers, gesturing animatedly as she recounted her fabricated story. The reality of it all hit him like a punch to the gut. His life, his dignity, everything he had worked so hard to preserve, had been twisted, shattered in a single moment. As they sped through the night, Jerome sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling. His only crime, it seemed, was being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, with no voice, no power, and no one willing to believe his truth. Jerome's arrival at the police station was a blur of harsh lights, raised voices, and rough hands. From the moment he was pulled out of the squad car, it was clear to him that the officers saw him as nothing more than a criminal. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, the metal biting into his skin with every step as they led him inside. He tried to explain, his voice shaking with a mixture of panic and frustration, but each attempt was met with cold indifference. They didn't want to listen. To them, he was just another suspect, another name on a roster of offenders who would be processed, locked up, and forgotten. Judge Harper's accusations seemed to carry more weight than anything he could ever say in his defense. They led him to an empty cell, shoved him inside, and slammed the door with a loud clang that echoed through the dim, empty corridor. The chill of the concrete walls seemed to seep into his bones, and as he sank onto the narrow bench, a feeling of helplessness washed over him. This was no temporary mistake. He could see it in the way they looked at him, in their dismissive attitudes. In their eyes, he was guilty. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Jerome could no longer tell. There was no clock, no window, nothing but the dim light that flickered above him, casting eerie shadows on the cell walls. His stomach growled, but no food was provided. His throat was dry, and the air felt stale, but water was a luxury they hadn't deemed him worthy of. They had left him in this cold, empty cell, alone and forgotten. Occasionally, officers would walk by, glancing in his direction with scornful expressions or muttering insults under their breath. "Bet he thought he could pull a fast one on her," one of them sneered as he passed by. Another officer, who seemed barely out of his teens, shook his head in disgust. "Can't believe he'd go after a judge. The nerve of some people." Jerome wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, but he knew it would fall on deaf ears. The truth was buried under layers of prejudice and power, and his voice was muffled by the walls of their indifference. Each hour that passed chipped away at his resolve, the silence pressing down on him like a weight that refused to lift. As the hours stretched on, he let his mind wander back to that night, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. He had saved her life, pulled her from that car as it erupted in flames, risking everything to help her. And yet, she had twisted it, turned his act of kindness into an accusation, transforming him from a savior into a monster in the eyes of the law. Outside the cold walls of his cell, however, the world was not as quiet as Jerome believed. Unbeknownst to him, someone had captured the incident on video, a passerby or perhaps a curious onlooker. The video was shaky, the audio distorted by the crackling flames and distant screams, but the image was clear. Jerome running toward the burning car, smashing the window, pulling Judge Harper to safety. And then the scene took a darker turn as the police arrived, and Judge Harper, her face twisted in accusation, pointed directly at him, blaming him for the fire. The video spread quickly across social media, and soon the story had reached thousands. Outrage began to build as people watched the footage, horrified by the injustice of what had transpired. Comments flooded in, each one angrier than the last. People demanded justice for Jerome, calling out the unfair treatment, the racial bias, the harshness of a system that had turned against an innocent man. In the city, protests began to organize, small at first, but growing by the hour. Groups gathered outside the police station, holding signs and chanting for Jerome's release. "Free Jerome Brown!" they shouted, their voices filling the night. They refused to leave, determined to stand against the injustice they had witnessed, even if only through a screen. Back in his cell, Jerome was oblivious to the storm brewing outside. His body was weak, his throat parched, his mind a fog of exhaustion and despair. He had lost track of time, lost track of reality itself as he sat in silence, feeling the weight of his own hopelessness. The faint sounds of the bustling police station outside his cell felt distant, like echoes from another world. In his cold cell, he was alone, cut off from everything he had ever known, with only his racing thoughts for company. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, her cold, cruel eyes, accusing him with a single glance. He saw the moment her expression changed from fear to contempt, the way she had looked at him as if he were less than human, as if saving her life had been an affront to her. He wondered if she even understood the damage she had done, or if she simply didn't care. To her, he was just a pawn, a tool to be used, discarded, and forgotten. The hours dragged on, blending together in a haze of hunger, thirst, and cold. His wrists throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs they had only just removed, and his muscles ached from the rough treatment he had endured. But worse than the physical discomfort was the knowledge that, to them, he was guilty. His words, his truth, didn't matter. In the eyes of the law, Judge Harper's word was enough to condemn him. And yet, the world outside had not forgotten him. As the video continued to spread, gaining traction on social media, news outlets began picking up the story. Reporters dug deeper, uncovering more details, and soon the narrative began to shift. Questions arose about Judge Harper's history, about her record of rulings, particularly in cases involving black defendants. Whispers of racial bias and unjust rulings surfaced, casting a shadow over her once respected career. As the protests outside the station grew louder, the police department found itself under scrutiny. Reporters gathered, their cameras capturing every moment, every chant, every demand for justice. People who had once feared speaking out against Judge Harper now found their voices, emboldened by the support from others who had seen the truth of Jerome's situation. The weight of public pressure began to mount, and the police were forced to acknowledge the outrage they could no longer ignore. Jerome remained unaware of the movement taking shape outside the walls of his cell. Days passed, each one blending into the next, each hour dragging him deeper into despair. His body weakened, his stomach ached, and his mouth was dry, his cracked lips a painful reminder of the neglect he had endured. He tried calling out to the officers when they passed, asking for water, for food, for any sign of acknowledgement, but each request was met with cold indifference. To them, he was less than nothing. A black man accused of a crime against a respected judge. He was already guilty in their eyes, already condemned to be forgotten. And still, the protests grew. People from neighboring cities arrived to join the movement, and what had begun as a small protest had now transformed into a citywide demonstration. Signs waved in the air, bold letters demanding freedom for Jerome and an end to racial injustice. News crews broadcasted live from the scene, their voices filling living rooms across the country as they reported on the injustice unfolding before their eyes. Inside his cell, Jerome sat in silence, his mind drifting between fear and despair. The isolation pressed down on him, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. He thought of his family, the few friends he had left, people who might have been wondering where he was. But even as hope flickered in his mind, it quickly faded, replaced by the cold reality of his situation. No one would believe him. Not against the word of a judge, not against the weight of the system. But as the sun set on the third day, something changed. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, louder than before, purposeful and unhurried. Jerome lifted his head, his vision blurry from exhaustion as the footsteps grew nearer. He heard the jingle of keys, the click of a lock being turned, and then the door to his cell swung open. 2 officers stood in the doorway, their expressions unreadable, but behind them stood another man, a lawyer dressed in a suit, his face set in a grim, determined line. "Mr. Brown," the lawyer said, his voice calm but firm, "we're going to get you out of here." Jerome blinked, struggling to understand. What's happening?" he managed to croak, his voice hoarse from days of silence. The lawyer glanced at the officers before turning back to Jerome. "Your case has gained a lot of attention. People are demanding your release. It's time for you to go." With shaky legs, Jerome stood, his body weakened from neglect, and allowed the officers to guide him out of the cell. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists once more, but this time there was a glimmer of hope, a hint of freedom on the horizon. As they led him down the hallway, the noise from outside grew louder, a chorus of voices chanting, calling for justice. When they reached the front of the station, Jerome's lawyer placed a steadying hand on his arm. "You've got a lot of people fighting for you now," he said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope warmed Jerome's chest, a tiny spark that pushed away the despair that had settled so heavily upon him. As they stepped through the doors and into the night air, the noise grew into a roar. And there, in the street outside the station, stood hundreds of people. Faces turned towards him, hands holding signs, their voices raised in unison, chanting his name. Jerome's breath caught in his throat as he looked out over the crowd, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, he knew he wasn't alone. The crowd outside the police station roared in support as Jerome Brown emerged, a small but determined figure under the harsh lights and the weight of the injustice he'd endured. The air was thick with tension and righteous anger, the chants echoing through the night. Camera flashes burst around him, capturing every angle of his face as reporters crowded closer, microphones in hand, eager for a statement from the man whose story had become a rallying cry for justice. His lawyer, Mr. Green, kept a steadying hand on Jerome's arm as they moved toward the waiting car. Despite the whirlwind of noise, the energy of the protest, and the blinding lights, Jerome felt a strange, heavy calm settle over him. The days of isolation, fear, and hopelessness had changed something in him, sharpened his focus on the injustice he'd suffered. He looked out over the sea of people, faces of all ages and races united in their demand for his freedom and for justice. These people had not abandoned him, had not let him be swallowed by the lies that tried to condemn him. Once inside the car, Jerome felt the tension ease slightly, though his hands still shook as he clasped them in his lap. Mr. Green spoke softly beside him, his words barely audible over the chants outside. "This is far from over, Jerome," he said, his tone steady but charged with determination. "We've got hearings, and I intend to push for a full investigation into Judge Harper. She must be held accountable for what she's done to you, and possibly to many others." Jerome nodded, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the protest and the rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. As they drove through the streets, past clusters of people waving signs and calling for justice, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, his life would not be defined by the lie Judge Harper had spun. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings with Mr. Green, interviews with reporters, and preparations for the hearing that would decide his fate. The courthouse, once a place where he moved in silent servitude, now became a stage for a fight far larger than any he had ever known. People gathered outside each day, filling the steps with chants and signs, demanding justice, demanding change. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the entryway, cameras and microphones poised as Jerome stepped out of the car, his face solemn, but his eyes fierce with determination. The crowd greeted him with a thunderous cheer, their voices a wall of support that seemed to bolster his spirit as he entered the building. Inside, the courtroom was tense and quiet, every seat filled with people waiting to witness the trial of not just a man, but of a system that had failed him. Across the room sat Judge Harper, her usual stern composure now cracked, her face pale and strained. The weight of public scrutiny and mounting evidence of her misconduct had stripped her of the authority she once wielded so carelessly. Her lawyer sat beside her, rifling through papers, whispering hurried reassurances that seemed to do little to calm her frayed nerves. As Jerome took his seat beside Mr. Green, he felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. But he sat tall, unbroken, prepared to tell his story. He would not be silenced. The judge presiding over the hearing called the court to order, and the lawyers began presenting their arguments. Mr. Green spoke with calm conviction, laying out the events of that night with careful precision, painting a picture of a man who had acted out of instinct and kindness, only to be betrayed and wrongly accused. Then came the video, the footage that had sparked a national movement. The screen showed Jerome running toward the burning car, smashing the window, reaching inside to pull Judge Harper to safety. And then it showed the arrival of the police, her accusation, her words filled with venom as she pointed to him, accusing him of a crime he hadn't committed. Gasps filled the courtroom as the video ended, a palpable shock settling over the room. Next, Mr. Green called witnesses to the stand, members of the courthouse staff, people who had known of Judge Harper's treatment of Jerome, and former defendants who had felt the sting of her biased rulings. Each testimony built upon the last, unraveling the carefully constructed image Judge Harper had maintained for years. By the time Jerome himself took the stand, the weight of her actions had already begun to crush the remnants of her reputation. As he recounted his ordeal, the fear, the isolation, the days spent in a cold, dark cell without food or water, his voice wavered, but he held his composure. He described the night he had pulled her from the flames, the terror in her eyes, and then the betrayal as she accused him, her voice cold and unfeeling. When he finished, silence filled the courtroom, the gravity of his words hanging in the air like a shadow. The judge overseeing the case looked to Mr. Green, who nodded, signaling the end of Jerome's testimony. Finally, Judge Harper herself was called to testify. She stepped forward, her face taut, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the stand. Her lawyer attempted to argue her case, framing her actions as those of a woman in shock, a victim who had acted out of fear. But the evidence against her was undeniable, and each attempt at justification rang hollow in the face of the truth that had been laid bare. After hours of arguments and testimonies, the court was adjourned and everyone filed out, the tension thick as they awaited the final decision. Days passed before the court reconvened, but the protests outside never ceased. Jerome watched the news reports from his temporary residence, seeing crowds grow larger, chants grow louder, and support pour in from across the country. His story had become more than his own. It was a catalyst for a movement, a symbol of the fight against a system that had failed so many. Finally, the day of judgment arrived. The courtroom was packed once again, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Jerome sat beside Mr. Green, his hands clenched tightly together as he waited, his heart pounding in his chest. The judge entered, and a hush fell over the room. She looked solemn as she took her seat, her gaze steady as she began to read the final ruling. "Judge Mary Harper," she said, her voice firm and unwavering, "the evidence presented before this court has shown a clear pattern of misconduct, racial bias, and abuse of power. Your actions on the night in question, as well as your history of unjust rulings, have demonstrated a severe breach of the ethical standards expected of your position." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom as the judge continued, her tone unwavering. "It is the decision of this court that Judge Harper be stripped of her position and charged with filing false police reports, obstruction of justice, and malicious prosecution." A stunned silence followed, and then a wave of emotion rolled over the courtroom. Gasps, relieved sighs, even a few quiet cheers filled the air. Jerome felt a surge of relief so profound it almost brought tears to his eyes. Justice had been served, but the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she said, "the court will recommend a full investigation into Judge Harper's past rulings. Any cases found to be influenced by racial bias will be reopened and reevaluated." Jerome's breath caught as he realized the weight of her words. This wasn't just about him anymore. His fight had uncovered something much larger, a legacy of injustice that would finally be addressed. As the ruling was finalized, Judge Harper's lawyer hung his head, his client visibly defeated. Jerome watched as she was escorted from the courtroom, her once proud posture replaced by a slumped resignation. She had tried to destroy him, but now it was her life unraveling before the world. The courtroom erupted into noise as people began to file out, reporters scrambling to capture every moment, every reaction. Outside, the crowd cheered as the news spread, their voices rising in a celebration of justice. As Jerome stepped outside, the sun warm on his face, he was greeted by a wave of applause, cheers, and shouts of encouragement. People reached out to shake his hand, offering words of support, gratitude, and solidarity. For the first time, Jerome felt the weight of the past few days lift, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Mr. Green stood beside him, his face filled with pride. "You did it, Jerome," he said quietly. "You fought for the truth, and you won." Jerome looked out over the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had endured the worst of injustice, but he had not been defeated. And now his story, his voice, had become a beacon of hope, a rallying cry for those who had been silenced, ignored, and oppressed. As he walked through the crowd, shaking hands, receiving hugs from strangers who had fought for him, he knew that this was only the beginning. The world had seen the truth, and the fight for justice was far from over. But, for today at least, they had won. Incredible story, right? Justice was finally served, but the fight isn't over. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more powerful stories of resilience and hope. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters. And be sure to check out our other videos to hear more inspiring stories of truth and justice.